They came for me on a Tuesday. Not with fanfare or ceremony, but with shock malls and data slates, dragging me out of a hab-block stairwell where I'd been scrubbing the same grease stain for 3 hours. I didn't get to say goodbye. I didn't get a choice. One moment I was Reinal Hargos, sanitation technician, a man with a ration card and a cot in Hive Turt's lower districts. The next, I was property of the Astra Militarum, a number stamped onto my forearm in black ink, and a body assigned to die on a planet I'd never heard of. Within 3 months, I watched half my squad die screaming in a trench we abandoned the next morning. Let me tell you what the Imperial Guard actually does to ordinary people like me. Before we go further, I need you to understand something. This story isn't propaganda. It's not a recruitment vid or a sermon from the mini-Storum. It's the truth, the kind that gets buried under official reports and casualty ledgers. If you want to hear what really happens when the Imperium reaches down and pulls you into its war machine, stay with me. And if this resonates with you, if you want to hear more stories from the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, hit that like button, share this with someone who needs to see it, and subscribe. Because the Imperium doesn't tell these stories. We do. I used to believe the stories they told us. Not because I was stupid or naive, but because believing them made the universe feel smaller, more manageable, like something that could be understood if you just worked hard enough and kept your head down. I was Reinal Hargos, a sanitation technician on Hive Turt, and my entire existence revolved around scrubbing the floors of Hab Block 7739 until the grime came away in black streaks and the smell of industrial cleaner overpowered the reek of 60,000 souls packed into crumbling ferrocrete. I had a rotation schedule, a ration card, a cot in a dormitory where the lights never fully dimmed, and a supervisor who barely remembered my name. That was my life. That was all I expected it to be. The Imperium was a distant thing, a concept wrapped in gilded propaganda posters and the crackling voice of the administratum announcer who droned through the voxcasters every morning at 0600, reminding us that our labor served the God Emperor, and that our devotion would be rewarded in the life hereafter. I scrubbed floors. I ate protein paste from tin cans. I slept when exhaustion dragged me under. I never thought the Imperium would reach down and pull me into its machinery. Never imagined that my name would appear on a list somewhere in a data stack, flagged for extraction like a component in a manufacturum line. The tithe came on a Tuesday. I remember that detail because Tuesdays were wash cycle days, and I had just finished hauling a cart of soiled linens down 3 levels when the enforcers arrived. They wore black carapace armor that gleamed under the flickering lumens, their faces hidden behind visored helmets, and they carried shock malls that hummed with restrained violence. They moved through the hab block like a surgical incision, methodical and efficient, and they carried data slates that glowed with names and identification numbers. I heard the screaming before I saw them. A woman 2 corridors over, pleading with them not to take her son, her voice rising into a shriek that was cut short by the wet crack of a maul meeting flesh. Then silence. Then the sound of boots on metal grating, growing closer. I stood there holding a mop, water dripping from the strands onto my boots, and I watched as they turned the corner and stopped in front of me. One of them raised a data slate. The screen flickered. He read my name aloud, mispronouncing the last syllable, and told me I had been selected for Imperial service. I asked what that meant. He told me to drop the mop and follow. I asked if I could retrieve my belongings. He struck me across the jaw with the butt of his maul, and I tasted blood and broken enamel, and I understood that questions were not part of the process. They herded us into cargo lifts. 60 or 70 of us from the same block. All of us clutching our faces or our ribs. All of us silent except for the occasional sob that someone tried to muffle. The lift descended for what felt like an hour, passing through levels I had never seen. Industrial depths where the machinery was older than memory and the air tasted like rust and oil. When the doors finally opened, we were standing in a loading bay where the air was cold and tasted like ozone and recycled atmosphere. There were hundreds of others waiting, maybe thousands, all of them wearing the same expression of blank incomprehension. Some were crying. Most were simply standing there, their minds struggling to process what was happening. The enforcers split us into groups using nothing more than visual assessment, pointing left or right as we shuffled past, and I ended up in a line that snaked toward a row of armored transports. The sides of the transports were stamped with the Imperial Aquila, the two-headed eagle that symbolized the Imperium, and beneath it were numbers and designations I did not recognize. A man beside me whispered that we were being conscripted, that the planet owed the Imperium a tithe of bodies, and that we were the payment. I asked him how he knew. He said his brother had been taken 5 years ago and never came back. Then the enforcers shoved us forward, and there was no more time for questions. The transport ride lasted 3 days. We were packed into the cargo hold like livestock, standing shoulder to shoulder in the dark, breathing the same recycled air until it turned thick and sour. There were no seats, no latrines, no food or water for the first 20 hours. People urinated where they stood. Some collapsed and were trampled. The smell became unbearable, a mixture of sweat and waste and fear, and I kept my feet by bracing against the man in front of me, matching his sway as the transport rattled through what I assumed was atmospheric exit, and then the cold silence of void travel. My legs cramped. My throat felt like sandpaper. I thought about my cot in the dormitory, about the monotony of scrubbing floors, and I realized with a sharp clarity that I would have given anything to go back to that life, that the boredom I had resented was actually a kind of peace. When the transport finally docked and the ramp lowered, the light that poured in was so bright it felt like a physical blow. We stumbled out into a hangar that was larger than any structure I had ever seen. A space so vast that the ceiling disappeared into shadow, and the walls seemed to curve away into infinity. Servitors moved among us, their augmetic limbs clicking and whirring, attaching identification tags to our wrists with mechanical precision. A voice boomed from voxcasters mounted on the walls, instructing us to form ranks and proceed to processing. No one knew what that meant, but we moved anyway, following the servitors because there was nothing else to do. Processing was a nightmare dressed in bureaucracy. They stripped us naked and hosed us down with chemical wash that burned my skin and left me gasping. The spray was ice cold and it came from nozzles mounted in the ceiling, and we stood there shivering while servitors walked among us, spraying us with disinfectant that stung my eyes and filled my mouth with a taste like battery acid. They shaved our heads with electric clippers that caught and tore, leaving bloody furrows across my scalp. My hair fell in clumps onto the wet floor, mixing with the hair of hundreds of others, forming a carpet of human waste. They injected us with a series of needles, long and brutal, slamming into our arms and necks without explanation or anesthetic. Some of the injections made me vomit. Others left me shaking and feverish, my vision blurring at the edges. A woman collapsed beside me, convulsing on the floor, foam bubbling from her mouth, and the servitors simply dragged her away and continued processing the rest of us. They scanned us with handheld devices, recording our biometrics, and when one man refused to open his mouth for the oral scan, they broke his jaw with a punch and scanned him anyway. They tattooed a number onto my forearm, black ink etched into the skin with a machine that felt like it was carving bone, and the number was longer than my identification code from the hive, a string of digits that reduced me to a data point in some unimaginable ledger. They issued us uniforms, gray fatigues that smelled like disinfectant and fit no one properly, and boots that were stiff and ill-sized, the leather cracking when I flexed my toes. They gave us ration packs, dense blocks of compressed nutrients that tasted like salted cardboard, and canteens filled with water that had a metallic aftertaste. They told us we were now property of the Astra Militarum, and that our lives belonged to the God Emperor. We were given 4 hours to sleep. They marched us to a barracks that was nothing more than a warehouse with rows of cots, and they told us to find a bed and rest because training would begin at dawn. I collapsed onto the nearest cot, and the mattress was thin and hard and the blanket smelled like mildew, but I was so exhausted that I fell asleep within seconds. I dreamed of the hive, of my supervisor calling my name, of the endless corridors and the smell of industrial cleaner. And when I woke, I could not remember where I was for a moment, and then reality crashed back, and I felt a weight settle over me that I have never been able to shake. The training began immediately. We were marched to a parade ground that stretched for kilometers, a flat expanse of ferrocrete baking under a sun that was too bright and too white, nothing like the dim industrial glow of the hive. There were thousands of us arranged in blocks of 100, and at the front of each block stood a drill instructor, a man or woman in a uniform adorned with rank insignia I did not understand. Our instructor was a veteran named Sergeant Cull, a scarred brute with a voice like grinding metal and eyes that looked at us with open contempt. He paced in front of our formation, his boots striking the ferrocrete with sharp cracks, and he studied us as if we were diseased animals that needed to be put down. He told us that we were the lowest form of life in the Imperium, lower than orcs, lower than the filth that accumulated in the bilges of void ships. He told us that the only reason we were not executed on the spot was because the Emperor needed bodies to feed into the war machine, and that our training would determine whether we were worth the resources invested in us. He told us that most of us would not survive training, that we would die from exhaustion or injury or failure, and that those who did survive would wish they had not. He told us this without emotion, as if reciting a technical manual, and then he ordered us to run. We ran until people collapsed. The sun beat down on us like a hammer, and the ferrocrete radiated heat that made the air shimmer, and we ran in formation, trying to maintain cohesion, but within the first kilometer, people were falling behind. Cull ran alongside us on a motorized cart, shouting insults and corrections, and when someone fell, he would stop and kick them until they got up or stopped moving. We ran until blood filled my boots from blisters that burst and reformed. My lungs burned. My legs felt like they were made of wet sand. The man next to me vomited as he ran, the bile splattering his uniform, and he kept running because stopping meant punishment. We ran until the sun set and the temperature dropped and my breath came out in ragged clouds. When we finally stopped, Cull told us we had run 8 kilometers, and that tomorrow we would run 16. He did not smile when he said this. We limped back to the barracks, and I collapsed onto my cot without removing my boots, and I fell into a sleep so deep it felt like drowning. The days blurred into a single continuous ordeal. We woke before dawn to the blare of klaxons and assembled in the dark, standing at attention while Cull inspected us, searching for any flaw in our appearance or posture. A crooked collar earned a punch to the gut. A scuffed boot earned 10 laps around the parade ground. A moment of hesitation earned a beating so severe that the recruit was carried away by servitors and never seen again. We drilled with wooden rifles, practicing movements that made no sense, raising the stocks to our shoulders and sighting down barrels at imaginary targets while Cull screamed corrections and insults. We learned to march in formation, to turn in unison, to present arms, and the repetition was mind-numbing. Thousands of identical movements performed until muscle memory replaced conscious thought. We crawled through mud pits filled with barbed wire, the metal tearing at our uniforms and skin, and when someone cried out in pain, Cull would drag them out and beat them in front of the rest of us, explaining that weakness was contagious and had to be purged. We learned to disassemble and reassemble loss guns, the standard-issue rifle of the Imperial Guard, and the first time I held one, I was struck by how light it felt, how innocuous, as if something so simple could not possibly be responsible for the oceans of blood that Cull assured us we would spill. The weapon became an extension of my body. We practiced loading and unloading the power packs, the small rectangular cells that fed energy to the loss gun, and Cull timed us, demanding that we complete the process in under 3 seconds. Anyone who failed was made to do push-ups until their arms gave out, and then they were made to do more. We fired at target ranges, and the lost bolts cracked through the air with a sound like breaking glass, and the targets exploded into showers of fused ceramic. The recoil was negligible, but the heat buildup was intense, and after 100 shots, the barrel glowed red and the air around it shimmered. Cull taught us to fire in controlled bursts, to conserve ammunition, to aim for center mass because headshots were a fantasy sold in training vids. He taught us to maintain our weapons, to clean the focusing crystals and check the power couplings, and he beat anyone whose weapon malfunctioned during inspection. I learned to care for my lost gun with a meticulousness I had never applied to anything in my life, because I understood that this weapon was the only thing standing between me and death. The nights were worse than the days. We slept in barracks that housed 200 men, rows of cots arranged with geometric precision, and the air was thick with the smell of sweat and unwashed bodies and the sharp tang of fear. Men wept into their pillows, trying to muffle the sound, but the silence amplified everything, turned every sniffle into a symphony of despair. Some prayed to the Emperor, reciting litanies they had learned as children, their voices cracking with devotion or desperation or both. Others sat on the edges of their cots and stared at nothing, their eyes hollow, their minds retreating into places where the drills and the beatings could not reach. I tried to sleep but found that exhaustion was not the same as rest, that my body would collapse but my mind would continue running, replaying the day in fractured loops, imagining all the ways I might fail tomorrow. I thought about escape. Everyone did. The windows were barred and the doors were locked from the outside, and the perimeter was patrolled by guards with shotguns and cybermastiffs that could smell fear. A man named Joro tried to run during the second week. They caught him before he reached the fence. They brought him back to the parade ground and made us watch as a commissar, a figure in a long black coat with a peaked cap and a bolt pistol holstered at his hip, executed him with a single shot to the back of the head. The commissar explained that cowardice was the greatest sin a guardsman could commit, and that Joro's death was a mercy because it spared him the deeper shame of failing the Emperor. Then the commissar ordered us to resume training, and we did, stepping over the body because the servitors had not yet arrived to remove it. The food was designed to sustain, not nourish. We ate in a mess hall that could seat thousands, long tables arranged in rows, and the servitors ladled gray slop into our trays with mechanical indifference. The slop was protein paste mixed with grain filler, and it had the texture of wet sand and a taste that made my stomach rebel even as I forced it down. There was never enough. The portions were calculated to keep us functional but constantly hungry, and I learned to eat quickly, shoveling the food into my mouth before my brain could register what I was consuming. Men fought over scraps. A piece of bread, a spoonful of extra paste, these became treasures worth bloodying a nose or breaking a finger. Cull watched these fights with approval, explaining that aggression was a virtue, that we needed to learn to take what we wanted because the battlefield would offer nothing freely. I avoided the fights at first, telling myself that preserving my strength was more important than satisfying my hunger, but eventually I learned that avoiding conflict was impossible, that the strong preyed on the weak, and that the only way to survive was to establish yourself as someone not worth targeting. I broke a man's nose over a ration bar during the third week, hitting him hard enough that blood sprayed across the table, and after that, people left me alone. The lectures were propaganda wrapped in theology. Every third day we were marched to an auditorium where a mini-storum priest delivered sermons about the glory of the Imperium and the righteousness of our cause. The priest was an ancient man with a voice that boomed through vox enhancers, and he wore robes embroidered with scripture and carried a staff topped with a golden aquila. He told us that humanity was beset on all sides by Xeno's filth and heretical traitors, that the galaxy was a battlefield where only the faithful could prevail, and that our deaths would be offerings to the God Emperor who sat upon the golden throne and protected us from the darkness beyond. He told us that pain was sanctifying, that suffering was proof of devotion, and that the guardsman who died in service was elevated to a place of honor in the Emperor's sight. He showed us picked recordings of battles, Grainy footage of guardsmen charging across fields of fire, their lost guns blazing, and the narrator spoke of courage and sacrifice as if those words had weight and meaning. I listened to these sermons and felt nothing. The words washed over me like noise, meaningless and distant, and I realized that I did not believe them. Not because I doubted the emperor, but because the priest spoke of glory and honor as if they were things we would experience, and I had already seen enough to know that what awaited us was neither glorious nor honorable. It was simply death, packaged in rhetoric to make it palatable. The training intensified as the weeks progressed. We moved from basic drills to live-fire exercises, advancing across open ground while targets popped up at random intervals, and the lost bolt sizzled past my head close enough to feel the heat. Men were hit, their uniforms scorched, their skin blistered, and they were dragged off the field while Cull screamed that they were too slow, too weak. We practiced bayonet charges, screaming as we ran toward padded dummies and drove the blades into their cloth bodies, and Cull walked among us, correcting our form, showing us how to twist the blade to maximize damage, how to pull it free without getting stuck. We learned to throw grenades, primitive frag explosives that detonated with a roar and sent shrapnel whining through the air, and the first time I pulled a pin and hurled one downrange, I felt a sick exhilaration that I immediately hated. We were taught to dig trenches, to construct firing positions, to move under cover, and every lesson was accompanied by the understanding that these skills were not theoretical, that soon we would be using them to stay alive while others tried to kill us. The indoctrination sessions were relentless. We were required to memorize the Imperial Creed, a litany of faith that began with the declaration that the Emperor was the master of mankind and ended with the promise that betrayal was the only unforgivable sin. We recited it every morning, shouting the words in unison, and the repetition was designed to carve it into our minds, to make it reflexive, so that even in the chaos of battle, we would remember who we served. We were shown picked recordings of Xeno's species. Horrible images of orcs with their brutish faces and crude weapons, Tyranids with their chitinous bodies and endless hunger, and Eldari with their alien grace and incomprehensible motives. The narration explained that these creatures were abominations, that they sought to exterminate humanity, and that our duty was to kill them without mercy or hesitation. We were shown recordings of heretics, humans who had turned from the Emperor's light, and the punishments they received were so brutal that men vomited or looked away. But we were forced to watch, forced to internalize the lesson that deviation from the Imperial Creed was a fate worse than death. I watched these recordings and felt a growing numbness, a sense that my capacity for horror was being worn down, that I was being conditioned to accept atrocity as routine. The fourth week brought the first major casualties. A man in my barracks named Venick collapsed during a march, his heart giving out under the strain, and the medics pronounced him dead on the spot. Cull ordered us to step over him and continue. A woman named Sarah was crushed by a falling piece of equipment during a demolition drill, her body pinned beneath a metal beam, and we listened to her scream for 20 minutes before a servitor arrived with cutting tools and freed her corpse. A recruit named Loras lost his mind during a night drill, attacking Cull with his bare hands, and the commissar executed him before he could land a single blow. The deaths were not acknowledged with ceremony or mourning. They were simply facts, logged in a data slate and forgotten, and the rest of us learned to view them with detachment, to understand that sentiment was a liability. I stopped learning names. I stopped making eye contact. I focused only on the tasks in front of me, and I told myself that survival was a matter of obedience, that if I followed orders and did not hesitate, I might live long enough to see the end of this. But there was no end. The training continued for 3 months, and by the time it was over, our initial group of 200 had been reduced to 70. The rest were dead or injured beyond recovery, or had simply disappeared, their fates unknown and unquestioned. We were harder now, leaner, our bodies scarred and calloused, our movements efficient and mechanical. We could strip and reassemble a lost gun in under 2 seconds. We could march 40 kilometers without rest. We could sleep standing up. We had been broken and rebuilt into something that barely resembled human beings, and Kull looked at us with something that might have been satisfaction and told us we were ready for the final test. The final test came on the 50th day. We were woken in the middle of the night and marched to a transport hangar where shuttles waited with their ramps lowered and their engines idling. Kull told us that we were being deployed to a live combat zone, that this was our graduation exercise, and that those who survived would be inducted into the regiment. He did not elaborate on what awaited us. We boarded the shuttles in silence, strapping ourselves into the crash harnesses, and the ramps sealed with a hiss of hydraulics. The interior of the shuttle was cramped and dark, lit only by red emergency lumens, and the air smelled like promethium and recycled sweat. The flight was rough, the shuttle bucking and shaking as it descended through atmospheric turbulence, and the man next to me vomited into a bag, the smell filling the cabin. I gripped the harness and tried to steady my breathing, tried to remember the drills, the training, the endless repetition that was supposed to prepare me for this moment. But my mind was blank, a white static of fear. The shuttle touched down with a bone-jarring impact, and the ramp dropped, and the sound that rushed in was unlike anything I had ever heard. Explosions. Screaming. The crack of lost-gun fire. The roar of something inhuman. We were herded out into chaos. The landscape was a nightmare of shattered rockcrete and burning wreckage. The ground churned into mud by bombardment, and the sky was a sickly orange, choked with smoke and ash. Kull was there, bellowing orders, and we formed a ragged line and advanced toward a trench system that was under assault. I could see shapes moving in the smoke, low and hunched, their silhouettes wrong in ways I could not articulate. The veterans in front of us opened fire, their lost guns spitting bolts of coherent light, and the shapes convulsed and fell. But there were more. Always more. Kull shoved a lost gun into my hands and told me to fire. I raised the weapon, sighted down the barrel, and pulled the trigger. The recoil was negligible, but the sound was deafening, and I did not see what I hit, only that the shapes kept coming. We fired until the power packs ran dry, and then we reloaded, fumbling with the fresh packs, and we fired again. Men fell around me, their bodies torn apart by projectiles I could not see, and I stepped over them because stopping meant dying. The fighting lasted for hours, or maybe minutes. Time lost all meaning in the chaos. The enemy pressed forward in waves, and we held the line because retreating was not an option. And when the lost gun in my hands overheated and refused to fire, I picked up another from a corpse and kept shooting. The trench filled with smoke and the smell of burnt flesh, and visibility dropped to a few meters, and I fired at anything that moved, trusting that the shapes in the smoke were hostile because there was no time to verify. A creature broke through the line and lunged at me, and I saw it clearly for the first time. A thing with too many limbs and a face that was all teeth and eyes. I stabbed it with my bayonet, driving the blade into its torso, and it shrieked and clawed at me, tearing through my uniform, and I twisted the blade and pulled it free, and the creature collapsed, and I kept moving. When the enemy finally withdrew, we were ordered to hold the trench and wait for reinforcements. The trench was a mass grave waiting to happen. It was barely a meter deep, the walls crumbling, and the bottom was ankle-deep in water mixed with blood and other fluids I did not want to identify. Bodies lay in heaps, some of them our recruits, others veterans from the regiment we were joining, and the smell was so overpowering that I vomited until there was nothing left in my stomach. I crouched in the trench and tried to reload my lost gun, but my hands were shaking so badly that I dropped the power pack twice. A veteran grabbed my wrist and guided my hands, showing me how to lock the pack into place, and his voice was calm, almost bored, as if this was routine. He told me that the enemy would come again, that they always came again, and that my job was to keep firing until I was dead or they were. I asked him what we were fighting. He laughed, a sound like broken glass, and said it did not matter. That the enemy was just another faceless horror in a galaxy full of them, and that knowing their name would not help me kill them. The reinforcements arrived at dawn. Armored transports rolled up to the trench line, disgorging squads of guardsmen who moved with practiced efficiency, setting up heavy weapon emplacements and establishing firing lanes. An officer, a lieutenant with a bionic eye and a voice that cut through the noise, ordered us to fall in and prepare for redeployment. We climbed out of the trench, and I looked back at the bodies we were leaving behind, and I realized that no one was going to retrieve them, that they would rot where they fell, another layer of organic matter ground into the soil of this forgotten world. We marched to a staging area where more recruits were gathering, survivors from other training cohorts, and Cull appeared and informed us that we had passed the test, that we were now officially guardsmen of the Astra Militarum. There was no ceremony, no congratulations, only the curt acknowledgement that we had not died and therefore we were useful. We were issued regimental insignia, patches that we sewed onto our uniforms, and dog tags, metal discs stamped with our names and identification numbers. And I understood that these tags were not for us, but for whoever would eventually collect our bodies. We were assigned to the 73rd Christian Fusiliers. The regiment was under strength, depleted by months of continuous fighting, and we were the fresh meat brought in to fill the gaps. The veterans looked at us with a mixture of pity and contempt, and they did not bother learning our names because they knew most of us would not last a week. We were integrated into squads, 10 men each, and my squad was led by a corporal named Dave Rick, a wiry man with a face like a skull and a lost gun that looked like it had been held together with wire and faith. Dave Rick had been in the Guard for 7 years, which was an eternity in a profession where most men died in their first deployment. He had scars that covered his arms and neck, and he was missing 2 fingers on his left hand, and he moved with the careful precision of someone who knew that one mistake would be his last. He gathered us in a corner of the barracks and told us the rules. Rule 1. Follow orders without question. Rule 2. Never hesitate. Rule 3. Trust no one, not even him, because in the Guard, everyone was expendable. He told us that heroics would get us killed, that the officers who gave the orders were safe in command bunkers kilometers away, and that our only job was to stay alive long enough to follow the next order. He did not smile when he said this. He did not need to. The truth of it was self-evident. Our first deployment was to a frontline position designated Firebase Corvin. The Firebase was a cluster of fortifications built on a plateau overlooking a valley, and it was under near constant assault by an enemy that the briefings referred to only as Xenos hostiles. We traveled there in a convoy of transports, the vehicles grinding through mud and debris, and the journey took 12 hours even though the Firebase was only 40 kilometers away. The roads were cratered by artillery strikes, and twice we had to stop while combat engineers cleared wreckage from the path. I sat in the back of the transport and stared at the faces of the men around me, and I saw the same hollow expression I had seen in the mirror that morning. The look of people who had accepted that they were already dead and were simply waiting for the official confirmation. When we finally arrived, the Firebase was under bombardment, shells screaming down from the hills and detonating in geysers of dirt and shrapnel. We disembarked and ran for the nearest bunker, and I threw myself through the entrance and landed on top of another guardsman, and he shoved me off without a word, and we huddled there while the world shook and the walls groaned. The routine of the Firebase was a monotony punctuated by terror. We stood watch in shifts, manning firing slits in the bunker walls, staring out at the valley and waiting for the enemy to appear. The valley was a wasteland, scorched black by orbital bombardment, and nothing moved except the wind that carried ash and the smell of burning promethium. During the quiet hours, we cleaned our lost guns, checked our equipment, and ate ration bars that tasted like chemical sludge. We did not talk much. Conversation required energy, and energy was a resource we hoarded. The bunker was cramped and cold, and water dripped from the ceiling, forming puddles on the floor, and the air was thick with the smell of mold and unwashed bodies. I learned to sleep sitting up, my back against the wall, my lost gun cradled in my lap, and I learned to wake at the slightest sound, my finger automatically moving to the trigger. When the enemy attacked, they came in waves, hundreds of them surging up the slope, and we opened fire, our lost guns cutting them down. But they kept coming, and the air filled with the stench of ozone and scorched flesh. I learned to fire in controlled bursts, to conserve my power packs. I learned to aim for center mass because headshots were a fantasy sold in training vids. I learned to ignore the screams of the wounded, both ours and theirs, because acknowledging them meant acknowledging my own vulnerability. I learned that the officers who gave the orders were nowhere near the front line, that they observed the battle from command bunkers kilometers away, and that their strategies were built on acceptable losses, a term that meant we were expendable. I learned that survival was random, that skill and training mattered less than luck, and that the guardsman who lived was not necessarily the best, just the one who happened to be standing in the right place when the shells fell. I learned to hate the officers, to resent their clean uniforms and their safe positions, but I also learned that hate was useless, that it changed nothing, and that the only rational response was to follow orders and hope that the odds favored you for one more day. The casualties mounted with relentless efficiency. Our squad lost 2 men in the first week, both of them recruits like me, both of them killed by sniper fire that came from somewhere in the hills. Daverick did not mourn them. He simply reassigned their equipment to the survivors and requested replacements from command. The replacements arrived 3 days later, 2 terrified boys who looked even younger than I felt, and they were dead within 48 hours, torn apart by a mortar strike that landed directly on their position. I stopped counting the dead. The numbers were meaningless. What mattered was that the squad was shrinking, that we were being ground down, and that no one seemed to care as long as the firebase held. The firebase itself was a ruin. The walls pockmarked by impacts, the bunkers leaking water and filth, and the air inside was thick with mold and the smell of gangrene from the field hospital that occupied the central structure. I visited the hospital once. A man from our squad had been hit by shrapnel, his leg torn open from knee to hip, and Daverick ordered me to help carry him to the medics. We loaded him onto a stretcher and he screamed the entire way, his blood soaking through the canvas, and when we reached the hospital, I saw rows of cots filled with guardsmen missing limbs or half their faces, their bodies kept alive by machines and stimulants. The smell was indescribable, a mixture of antiseptic and rot and despair, and the medics moved among the wounded with mechanical efficiency, triaging based on utility rather than suffering. The man we had brought was deemed salvageable and they took him away, and I never saw him again. I left the hospital and vomited in a corner, and I understood that survival was not always preferable to death, that there were fates worse than dying in battle, and that the guard did not care about the quality of your existence, only whether you could still hold a lost gun. The commissar was a constant presence. His name was Veer, and he walked the trenches with his bolt pistol drawn, his eyes scanning for signs of weakness or dissent. He was a tall man, thin and severe, and he wore a long black coat that never seemed to get dirty, and his face was a mask of cold authority. He delivered speeches about duty and sacrifice, his voice rising over the sound of gunfire, and he executed a man for falling asleep on watch, shooting him in the temple and leaving the body as a warning. Veer explained that discipline was the only thing that separated guardsmen from animals, that without it we would collapse into chaos, and that he would personally ensure we maintained it. I hated him. We all did. But we also feared him, and that fear was stronger than hate, so we obeyed. Veer seemed to feed on our fear, to draw strength from it, and I realized that he was as much a part of the Imperial war machine as the lost guns and the artillery, a component designed to keep the line from breaking through sheer intimidation. The enemy adapted to our tactics. After the first month, their attacks became more coordinated, more sophisticated. They began using cover, advancing in short rushes rather than suicidal waves, and they targeted our heavy weapons first, eliminating our greatest advantages. They brought up their own artillery, primitive but effective, and the shelling intensified, turning the firebase into a hellscape of fire and debris. We lost the eastern bunker in the 6th week, the structure collapsing under a direct hit, and the 20 men inside were buried alive. We heard them screaming through the rubble, their voices growing fainter over the course of hours, and no one attempted a rescue because the shelling had not stopped and sending men to dig would have been suicide. Eventually, the screaming stopped, and we marked the bunker as lost and redistributed the survivors to other positions. The food situation deteriorated. Supply convoys were being hit by enemy raiders, and the rations that did arrive were spoiled or insufficient. We were put on half portions, and then quarter portions, and hunger became a constant companion, gnawing at my stomach and filling my thoughts. Men fought over scraps with a desperation that bordered on madness, and Dave Rick had to break up fights almost daily. I learned to scavenge, searching the bodies of the dead for ration bars or canteens, and I felt no shame in this, only a grim determination to stay alive. The veterans taught us to eat things we would never have considered food. Grubs from beneath rocks, roots dug from the scorched earth, even the flesh of the enemy when there was nothing else. I tried it once, a piece of meat carved from a creature we had killed, and it tasted like rancid fat and made me sick for days. But I survived, and that was all that mattered. The weather turned. The dry heat that had baked us for weeks gave way to cold rain, torrential downpours that turned the trenches into rivers and flooded the bunkers. We stood watch in water up to our knees, our uniforms soaked, our skin wrinkled and pale, and the cold seeped into our bones and stayed there. Men developed infections, their feet rotting inside their boots, and the medics had no supplies to treat them, so they simply cut away the dead tissue and sent the men back to the line. I developed a cough that would not go away, and every breath felt like inhaling broken glass. But I kept my rifle clean and my head down, and I told myself that I had survived worse, even though I could not remember when. The morale collapsed in the 3rd month. Men stopped caring about anything beyond the next meal or the next hour of sleep. The Imperial creed became a hollow joke, the words meaningless, and when the priest came to deliver a sermon, he was met with silence or open hostility. Dave Rick warned us to keep our mouths shut, that the commissar was watching, but the warning was unnecessary. We were too tired to rebel, too broken to care. We simply existed, moving from one moment to the next, and the only thing that kept us going was the knowledge that stopping meant dying, and dying meant the pain would finally end. But we were not quite ready for that yet. The orders came down in the 4th month. We were to abandon Firebase Corvin and fall back to a secondary position 30 kilometers to the east. The enemy had broken through on the southern flank and the firebase was at risk of being surrounded, so command had decided to reposition rather than risk losing the entire garrison. The order was framed as a tactical withdrawal, but everyone knew it was a retreat, and retreats in the Imperial Guard were synonymous with slaughter. We packed what we could carry, destroying anything of value that we could not take, and we formed a column and began marching east under cover of darkness. The enemy must have been watching, because they hit us within the first hour, ambushing the column from the hills, and the night erupted into fire and screaming. I ran, not toward the enemy but away, following the man in front of me, and the column disintegrated into a panicked rout. Artillery shells fell among us, each explosion a hammer blow that lifted bodies into the air and scattered them like debris. I saw Dave Rick take a hit, his torso obliterated, and I kept running because stopping meant dying. Lost bolts sizzled past my head, close enough to feel the heat, and I threw myself into a ditch and lay there, pressed against the cold mud, while the battle raged overhead. When the firing finally stopped, I crawled out and found that the column had scattered, that guardsmen were running in every direction, and I joined a group heading east because it seemed as good a direction as any. We ran until dawn, and when we finally regrouped, we had lost half the regiment. The survivors were herded into a makeshift camp. There were no fortifications, no supplies, just open ground and the exhausted remnants of a fighting force that had ceased to function as a cohesive unit. Officers screamed orders, trying to impose structure, but no one listened, and the guardsmen collapsed where they stood, too tired to care. I lay on the ground and stared at the sky, which was gray and featureless, and I realized that I felt nothing. No relief at having survived, no grief for the dead, no anger at the circumstances that had brought me here. I was hollow, a shell going through motions, and I understood that this was what the Guard did. It did not create heroes or warriors. It created automatons, meat puppets that followed orders until they stopped moving. A medic walked among us, checking for injuries. When he reached me, he asked if I was wounded. I told him I was not. He moved on. I continued staring at the sky. Eventually, someone brought food, a watery soup made from who knows what, and I forced it down because my body demanded fuel, even if my mind had stopped caring. Around me, men were doing the same, eating mechanically, their faces blank, and I realized that we had all crossed some invisible threshold, that we had moved from soldiers to survivors, and that the distinction was important, even if I could not articulate why. We were given 6 hours to rest. Then the officers returned, and they told us that we were being redeployed, that we were needed at another position, that the war continued and we were still useful. No one protested. Protest required energy we did not have. We gathered our equipment, checked our lost guns, and formed a ragged column, and we marched toward whatever fresh hell awaited us. The landscape was unchanging, a wasteland of scorched earth and ruined structures, and I wondered how long this war had been going on, how many men had died on this nameless world, and whether any of it mattered in the grand scheme of the Imperium's endless conflicts. The next position was worse than the fire base. It was nothing more than a trench line dug into the side of a hill, with no bunkers, no cover, just a shallow ditch and a pile of sandbags. The enemy was close enough that we could hear their movements in the dark, and the standing order was to hold the line until reinforcements arrived. No one believed reinforcements were coming. We settled into the trench and waited, our lost guns pointed at the darkness, and the night stretched on forever. The temperature dropped and frost formed on our uniforms, and I shivered so hard my teeth chattered. But I kept my finger on the trigger, kept my eyes on the horizon, and I told myself that I had survived this long, that I could survive one more night. The attack came at dawn. The enemy surged out of the mist, hundreds of them, and we opened fire, our lost guns blazing, but there were too many and they were too close. They reached the trench in seconds, and the fighting devolved into a brutal melee, bayonets and fists and improvised weapons, and I stabbed and kicked and clawed, and I killed 3 of them before I was knocked to the ground. A creature loomed over me, its weapon raised, and I thought this was it, this was the end, and then a lost bolt took it in the head, and it collapsed, and I scrambled to my feet and kept fighting. The battle lasted 20 minutes, and when it was over, half the trench was dead, and the survivors were covered in blood and filth, and we stood there gasping, too exhausted to celebrate our survival. An officer appeared. He was young, maybe 25, and he wore a clean uniform and carried a data slate, and he looked at us with something approaching disgust. He told us that we had held the line, that our sacrifice had bought time for the main force to regroup, and that we should be proud. No one responded. He repeated himself, louder this time, and when we still did not respond, he turned and walked away, muttering something about low morale. I watched him go, and I felt a surge of hatred so intense it made my hands shake. But I did nothing, because doing something would mean getting shot by a commissar, and I was not ready to die yet. The days blurred together. We moved from position to position, each one weaker than the last, and the regiment shrank with every engagement. I stopped trying to learn names or faces. People died and new people took their places and they died too, and the cycle repeated until it lost all meaning. I learned to function on autopilot, to load and fire and reload without thinking, to follow orders without processing them, and I told myself that this was survival, that this was what it took to stay alive in the Imperium's war machine. I have been a guardsman for 2 years now. I have fought on 7 worlds, killed more enemies than I can count, and survived battles that should have killed me a dozen times over. I have been wounded, starved, frozen, and burned, and I have watched entire regiments die around me, and I am still here. Not because I am skilled or lucky or blessed by the Emperor, but because I have learned to obey, to follow orders without question, to suppress everything human inside me and become the tool the Imperium needs me to be. I do not dream anymore. I do not think about the future. I do not imagine a life beyond the Guard, because there is no life beyond the Guard. Not for people like me. We are expendable, replaceable, and the moment we cease to be useful, we will be discarded without hesitation or regret. I have accepted this. I have accepted that my life has no value beyond its utility, that I am a cog in a machine so vast that my presence or absence makes no difference, and that when I die, I will be forgotten, my name erased from all records except the ledgers that track resources. But I am still alive. And as long as I am alive, I will continue to follow orders, to load and fire and reload, to march and dig and fight, because that is all I know how to do. The Guard has not made me a hero. It has not given me glory or honor or purpose. It has simply taught me to survive by destroying everything that made me human. And I carry that lesson with me every day, a weight that grows heavier with each passing hour. I am Reinal Hargos, Guardsman of the Astra Militarum, and I have learned the only lesson the Guard has to teach. Survival is not about heroism. It is about obedience. And obedience is the only way to postpone the inevitable.